So we're going to look at a section out of James. Kind of the traditional way that I was always taught James is this. It's kind of based on a wisdom book. It's supposed to be very practical and down to earth. I think compared to like some of the lofty abstract thinking you get in Paul's letters, right? But I was actually surprised reading this little section that we'll look at today that I thought there were some pretty lofty, heady statements about God, and he just kind of drops them in like a little bomb in the midst of this very practical advice. But one of the kind of main frameworks we're going to run into both in this section and in James overall is just he loves this phrase of imitation, imitate God, learn, and he'll say like, here's some kind of aspect, here's something about God, and here's how we kind of imitate it. And the image I had for that, the image I always think of when I do imitation was a story I heard from one of my favorite guitarists. The guy plays rockabilly guitar. His name is Jim Heath. He goes by the Reverend Horton Heat when he plays, which is kind of a funny joke that someone said, you're playing, sounds like you're playing as the gospel, so good. And he's like totally embarrassed of the nickname now because it's a little blasphemous in Texas where he plays a lot. But he's a classic rockabilly guitarist, an excellent musician. And so someone was asking him, say, okay, just how did you develop the discipline? How did you develop the discipline to play through your scales for hours to really get that very unique style that you're known for now? And he goes, honestly, it was when I was in high school. I played in this rockabilly band, and I was the lead guitarist. But in rockabilly music, kind of the classic solo that you kind of show like you've arrived in is you guys know the song, the Bill Haley song, "Rock Around the Clock." Mm-hmm. Have you ever listened to the solo in that one? It's actually, if you ever hear it on an oldies station or something, listen, it's an incredible solo. And so for a lot of people, that's the standard when you've crossed the line. And he said, we used to always cover that song in high school, and the guy who played piano was just better than me. And so every time we played that song, I had to hand over my guitar to that guy so he could play that solo and we could play that song. And I hated it. It was the most embarrassing thing ever. And so to make sure that this would not continue to happen to me my entire career, I watched him. I went over to his house when he was practicing, and I just watched him like a hawk. And I said, okay, how did he get to the point he can play that thing? And so I learned his habits. I did exactly what he did, and that's how I kind of built my own habits, was just looking at someone who was better, who embarrassed me because they were better, and that's how I put in the work. And so for me, that was kind of the imitation metaphor I had going into this sentence, that he's going to show something about God, right? And there's just times when it's like, I just can't seem to get that thing right. And when you really want it, like this guy Jim wanted it, right? He looked at the details. He watched all the little ways that this guy was learning so he could play that stupid solo. And that's kind of what we're asked to do by James in this passage we're going to look at too. Like, if you really want it bad enough, learn from the best, I think is kind of the idea on that one. And so the pattern you'll see in here is he's going to talk about God's character, how we imitate it, and then an example. And so if you're listening, James can be a little hard. Just it sounds a little bit like Proverbs. It feels like he's going boom, 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 and changing subjects all the time. But if you listen he says something about God. He'll encourage us to imitate, to watch those patterns, to learn the solo, right? And then he'll kind of give us some practical advice because he knows we're not that bright and need all the help we can get. So I'm going to start 17. James chapter 1, verse 17. Look, every good gift, every perfect gift comes from above. These gifts come down from the Father, the creator of the heavenly lights, in whose character there is no change at all. He chose to give us birth by his true word, and here is the result. We are like the first crop from the harvest of everything he created. Know this, my dear brothers and sisters. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to grow angry. This is because the angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. Therefore, with humility, set aside all moral filth and the growth of wickedness, and welcome the word planted deep inside you, the very word that is able to save you. You must be doers of the word, not only hearers who mislead themselves. Those who hear but don't do the word are like those who look at their faces in a mirror. They look at themselves, walk away, and immediately forget what they were like. But there are those who study the perfect law, the law of freedom, and continue to do it. They don't listen, and then they forget, but they put it into practice with their whole lives. They will be blessed in whatever they do. If those who claim devotion to God can't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this: caring for orphans and widows in their difficulties and keeping the world from contaminating them. So there's a ton in there that is good and we could spend a lot of time with. But my first reading, it still felt a little all over the place, right? So let's kind of break it down a little bit more, and I think we'll recognize that pattern I was talking about. It's just, okay, look at God, learn something, imitate God. Here's how you actually do that. Again, because he's assuming we're dumb, because he's probably right. Dumb and unspiritual. We'll do great. So the first couple verses, 17 and 18, he's going to tell us kind of really quickly who God is and who we are in his conversation. He says, look, every good gift, every perfect gift comes from above. These gifts come down from the Father, the creator of the heavenly lights, in whose character there is no change at all. So it's kind of a reverse sentence, but what he's basically saying here is, again, he talks about the character of God, right? What's unique and going to be important to this discussion about God's character? Well, here it's the constancy, the consistency of it, the fact that there is no change in it all. He's not getting washed around, right? God's character is stable. And how is that character expressed? It's expressed in blessing, right? He says every good thing, every blessing, all good things in the world are in fact God expressing his character of love, his character of unchangeableness, his character that desires to express itself in blessing. And blessing, of course, can be anything that is good, that brings thriving and beauty and light to the world, right? So the piece he's wanting to say here is, unlike us most of the time, right? We get good days, we get bad days. James later will talk about this great metaphor of the way we use our tongues. Sometimes we bring fresh spring water that makes the world better, and other times we bring briny salt water. That's not good for anything, right? Unlike that, God does one thing consistently. He blesses, he loves, he brings good things into the world. Therefore, we should do some imitation of God, because who are we? He chose to give us birth by his true word, and here's the result. We're like the first crop of the harvest of everything he created. So one of several startling statements in here is, you want to know a blessing? One of the biggest, most important blessings God gives to the world? It's us. Having met us, again, I question that at times, but who are we to say otherwise than God? One of the most important blessings, one of the first fruits, the ones that God is most proud of, loving, blessing, bringing light and goodness into the world, is us, the church. That can be hard to say. It takes some faith sometimes. And yet we can also surprise ourselves, and often one another. I think we can see this in one another at times better than we can see it in ourselves. One of the reasons we have community, right? We can point out these expressions of blessing, of goodness, and of light, sometimes in the world around us, better than we can see it in our own lives. We need each other to sometimes say, no matter what you say and what you feel like, I see God expressing good and lightness and blessing through you. It embarrasses us most of the time, but it's still true. And if our brothers and sisters can see it in us, God sure as hell can. Right? But it doesn't end there either, because I think if we really want to think about it, that statement, every good gift, every perfect gift comes down from above. That can be kind of offensive depending on your bend and take on how God relates to the world and how spirituality works, right? I think there are a lot of good and beautiful things in the world. A lot of people who are acting selflessly and who are expressing, making the world a better, more beautiful place. And for a lot of people are like, well, whatever, there's an ulterior motive. Or, no, that can't be possible because they're not one of us. They're not Jesus folk, so they couldn't really be doing that. The cynicism in that makes me a little sad. If you think God can only express beauty and good in the world through his people who know him and acknowledge him, I would also argue you have a little problem biblically with the number of people God claims as my servant. There's a great Old Testament example of the pagan king Cyrus, who is told multiple times in Isaiah, it says, my servant Cyrus, I am going to use him to free all of you, to bless you, to make the world a better place. If you look historically at who Cyrus was, most of us would be embarrassed to claim him as a friend, right? Let alone God, who specializes in beauty and goodness, claiming, no, he's my servant, and I will bring goodness through him. And he did. To be fair, that's what people may say about us at times, right? That person, God can't use that person. And God says, I bring beauty and I bring light into the world. And so I think it almost feels like a Where's Waldo game at times, right? You look around in the world in unexpected places. God is doing beautiful things. God is bringing that blessing in many unexpected ways. Probably a lot more than in expected ways. If we are willing to look, if we have the right eyes to see. Because that's what God is. He brings blessing. He brings goodness. Even through us. Even through another bit of the world, okay? And then, to kind of hunker down on this point for all of us a little, he continues in verse 19. He says, look, know this, my dear brothers and sisters. Again, this is the practical example piece, right? How do you actually live that out, being the first fruits of God's blessings? Well, let me give you some practical examples. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to grow angry. This is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. I don't really like that verse because I have a bit of a temper, so we're just going to strike it from the Bible and move on, please. An angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. And therefore, with humility, set aside moral filth and the growth of wickedness, and welcome the word planted deep inside you, the word that's able to save you. There's a quick metaphor there, but it's growth, it's planting again. It's just like Jesus likes to use, right? Jesus and his brother James grew up out in the countryside. They knew farming, they knew growth. And the interesting phrase I think here is that both evil and righteousness are not something that just happens. It's not like a single choice, here's the line, here's the black and white. Am I choosing to go to this or am I choosing to go to that? Yes, there are individual choices, but the growth he's talking about here is a character of consistency, blessing, and righteousness like God's, or, he never minces his words, or one of moral filth and wickedness. It's interesting to me that both of those are not a choice, but a growth. It's a lot of little choices. It is something that is nurtured, watered day after day. Think about the work of pruning something so it can grow into something bigger. God definitely has a part of that, and so do we. And so he's saying, look, imitating, you want to know what some of the things that this looks like? It looks like what we were talking about, not being an angry person. Angry people don't build things, they tear things down. I can testify to that. Anger's a lot better at ripping things apart than it is building things. We should be quick to listen. Man, what a different world we would be in if that one was a little more out there. Instead of blasting the person who disagrees with us, even if they're wrong, listening. And we think we can do that. But I've sat through too many trainings at this point on what listening actually involves and how utterly wretched I am at it to know that. Listening is a skill. It takes practice. It takes growth like anything else. It's really easy to just wait till someone else stops making noise so we can blast them back with our point, right? And get our idea across, because we're probably smarter than them and right. It takes humility, like he says in here. To shut up and listen, to actually hear the other person first, to give them the opportunity to be right first. Welcome the word planted deep inside you. There's a seed of that consistency, of that blessing that God wants to grow in us. It's there already. Which will we be nurturing? The word that will be able to save you. And I am looking back at my notes and realize one other really quick metaphor that he just kind of tosses in that I want to make sure we don't miss is in verse 18. He says, he chose to give us birth by his true word, and here's the result, the first crop. The language doesn't translate well to English, but they kind of switched to the crop metaphor here, where like the first crop, the first harvest, which is there, but the metaphors that he's actually working with here are actually both very human and very feminine throughout that entire thing. So I know we've talked before about sometimes we can get overstuck on manly images for God. This is one that this whole passage is like, no, God didn't just, teach you. He didn't just save you or whatever. He birthed our very identities. And for those of you who have given birth, I don't want to make light of what that is claiming about who we are, right? It's a painful process. It's a very intimate process as well. And God has not just snapped his fingers and made us, or planted a seed in the ground, getting his hands a little bit dirty, right? Who we are as imitators of God is something that he birthed. In 22 through 25, he pulls out another metaphor. So remember I was talking about kind of the learn the pattern, the imitation thing? The imitation thing he said first was, God's character of consistency is always going to lead to blessing and bringing goodness, right? Just like that, you must be doers of the word, not hearers who mislead themselves. So if there's something going on in us, like God's character is expressed in blessing, our faith needs to be expressed in action. The things we know about God are always going to need to be expressed, usually in blessing, the same way. That's what actions are most of the time, right? Bringing God's light and life, making things better everywhere we go. And so, again, that imitative thing is in this section, which, for some people is kind of an infamous section. But I think he's appealing to God's character, God's love, yet again here. He's also, this image of the fool who looks in the mirror is actually one he stole from kind of classic philosophy. Aristotle's got a section where he talks about this. Plato does as well. It's just kind of like, this is, it's like almost a bumper sticker. People knew this one and would have recognized it immediately, of the fool who doesn't remember what they look like. Again, remembering mirrors aren't that common back in the day, right? It's pretty hard to find a surface shiny enough to actually see your face in it. And they're not like our modern mirrors, like a piece of brass or whatever, so you kind of have to get close and look at it. And so when you get the opportunity to look at a mirror, right, the fool is the person who looks in it, sees a big old smudge across their face, and turns around and does nothing about it. And that's how the image is used both here and in other places. Like, when you get the opportunity to see what you actually look like, when you get the opportunity to actually learn or be in God's presence, you sure better do something about it. Use this. The classic fool is someone who's exposed to God's presence or a good teaching, and nothing changes. They just keep on keeping on like things are just fine. They ignore the smear of food on their face, right? That's the classic fool. Look, everyone should be quick. I just read that. Down in 22, look, you have to be doers of the word, not only hearers who mislead themselves. That's interesting to me. What is a fool? A fool is someone with no self-awareness. A fool is someone who doesn't even know who they are or what they are. They are self-deceived. so glad none of us would ever deceive ourselves on how righteous we actually are, right? They're like those who look at their face in a mirror, they look at themselves, walk away, and immediately forget what they were like. But then, there are those who study the perfect law, the law of freedom. There's an interesting phrase, not the way we think of it, right? The law of freedom. And they continue to do it. Not that one time they make the right choice, they just continue to do it. They practice it. They listen, but then they don't forget. They put into practice with their whole lives, and they will be blessed in whatever they do. Not because they're so righteous and so spiritual, because the consistency of learning something, putting it into practice to bless others, is in of itself blessing. It is God's presence. It is expressing what we've received from Him to another. It gets bigger and better the more we give it away. The more we express God's character, we tend to grow in our capacity to do so. There's a blessing that in that of itself. So again, let's get practical because we're not that smart. So if those who claim devotion to God, that's the ideal, don't be the fool, right? They can't control what they say. They are that fool. They mislead themselves. Can we control what we say? Again, I got a bit of a tongue on me. This passage is not making me look real good. If they can't control what they say, their devotion is worthless. Social skills, James. Hold the punches a little bit, please. Look, true devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this. Again, express blessing. Caring for orphans and widows, which again was the least. The people that nobody wanted anything to do with, the losers. Do we spend our time taking care of, impressing those who we can get something back out of in society? The movers and the shakers, those with influence, those who are interesting or experts? Or do we pay attention to the orphans, the widows, those who can't pay us back, those who will never give us influence, who probably aren't that much fun to be around, but are God's children? And so learning to love them the way God loves them, again, shows what we actually believe. That we actually know God, that we've been changed. We're not fools looking in the mirror. And to keep the world from contaminating them. There's a lot of directions you go with that one, right? What does the world value? Things like comfort, things like influence and expertise, the opposite of what we just said, right? They like winners. They like people whose names get to be in history books or in the newspaper or are cool, interesting. God says, are you self-deceived? Is that who you run after? Is that who interests you? Do we find ourselves valuing the same things our culture tells us to? Or are we going to imitate God? Let our consistency be in blessing. Not because some deserve it and some don't. Expressing love, expressing goodness. Discovering the worth in that which the world says is worthless. I think there's a blessing there in seeing what God can see, the simple things, the beauty of other human beings, right? So, obviously, as I read through this chapter, I didn't fare so well. Hopefully you fared a little better than I did. And I just find myself a little bit like the guy who has to hand over his guitar, embarrassingly saying, okay, show me how this thing's done. So I'm hoping to watch close this week. Watch close the things that God values. Watch close the patterns to learn the right ways of playing that guitar. Something worth imitating there. I've got a lot of room for improvement. So I'm going to imitate. Try and value a little bit more the things God does. Because I have been given so much. I have been so blessed by God's presence. I think that's worth passing on.